Okay, good afternoon and welcome to this seminar on improving the effectiveness of aid to promote economic development. We're very fortunate to have here with us for this seminar Shahid Zahid, who's Principal Planning and Policy Economist at the Asian Development Bank. Let me just tell you a little bit about Shahid's background, and then we'll get started into the seminar proper. Basically, at the moment at the ADB, Shahid handles coordination relations and coordinating harmonization and alignment agenda for the ADB and monitoring the implementation of the Paris Declaration on Aid Effectiveness. He's held a variety of positions in his 18 years or so at the Asian Development Bank. Prior to that, he taught in University of Karachi, Pakistan. And during his career, he's consulted with various bodies. I always pride myself on knowing acronyms, but I must admit I got lost on some of these. ILO, UNDP, IUCN, USAID, just to name a few. Anyway, in short, Zahid has a strong background in this whole issue of aid effectiveness, and most importantly, he's there at the operational level helping the Asian Development Bank in terms of moving the agenda forward. So I think perfect choice for speaker for this session. So thank you very much for coming, and the rules are up to you in terms of how long you want to speak for. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is a pleasure to be here. I used to be a university professor for many years, but I must admit I haven't addressed a large group of students in many years, so I hope I'm okay, and I hope you'll spare me some really difficult questions, although I'm used to a lot of difficult questions.
These are tough guys.
I'm sure they are. They may not look tough, but I'm sure they are. What I'm going to talk about today is generally about aid effectiveness, but I'm going to try and put it in a slightly broader perspective. Aid effectiveness sounds very narrow and very focused on just aid issues. I am going to really be talking about aid issues because I come from an aid agency, the Asian Development Bank. But I'm going to try and place aid effectiveness within the context of the broader development agenda, in particular within the agenda of what are now generally known as the Millennium Development Goals. I don't know if you are familiar with those, but in case you're not, I'll just briefly go over some of those as well. What I'll try to do is I have a PowerPoint presentation. I'll try and follow that as closely as I can. I had asked Charles to distribute a document that I had prepared as a background. I don't know if you all have had copies of that. That document provides a lot more detailed information on many of the topics that I will be covering. So I won't go into all those details during my lecture. I'll try and confine myself to about 45 minutes. I hope I can manage. And then we'll leave the rest of the time for question and answers and an open discussion or any issues you might care to discuss, preferably about the subject that we'll be talking about. So let's just start. First of all, I think before we begin, hello? No. I thought this worked. No? All right. Okay. This way. Right. First of all, let's just start with some very brief definitions. What exactly are we talking about when we talk about development assistance? You've probably heard the term official development assistance. What exactly is this term ODA? It's basically defined as government aid. That's aid provided by various governments. It's made up of grants. It's made up of concessional loans. It's provided to developing countries, and it's designed to promote economic development and the economic welfare of the recipient countries. That's a very simplistic definition of ODA, Official Development Assistance, and that's really what we're talking about when we're talking about the effectiveness of aid. Aid is official development assistance. Now, there are two principal sources of ODA. There is the traditional source, which is the OECD, the Organization of Economic and Cooperation Development, based in Paris. And then there is what we call the non-DAC. I'll just explain these terms. I'm sorry, we're kind of used to using acronyms, and we assume that everybody understands that, so forgive me if I use an acronym. If you don't understand any, please stop me and just ask right away. These are the two main sources of ODA. One is what we call OECD DAC development assistance, and the other is non-DAC or non-traditional development assistance. First of all, the OECD DAC. The DAC is something called the Development Assistance Committee of the OECD. It was set up in 1960. It comprises of the major bilateral donors. Bilateral donors are donors that provide aid or official development assistance country to country. The DAC basically concentrates on two key areas. First is how international development cooperation contributes to the capacity of developing countries to participate in the global economy, and it also tries to focus on overcoming poverty and make these developing countries and their societies fully participate in the development process. So that's the principal reasoning behind the assistance provided by the Development Assistance Committee. There are 22 members. They're all listed over there. I won't go into them. The last one you will notice is the European Commission, which is made up of many of the members there. There are 22 members of the Development Assistance Committee. Most of them are European. There is also Australia and New Zealand and Japan, and there is the US and Canada. That's the principal membership of the OECD Development Assistance Committee. The assistance that it provides is two forms of assistance. There is what we call multilateral assistance. This is the ODA that is provided to the multilateral organizations, and this kind of assistance is what we call unearmarked. In other words, it can be used for any purposes anywhere within the domain of that multilateral organization. Then there is bilateral assistance. This includes all other activities that are eligible to be counted as official development assistance. And this includes earmarked funding, which is given to a multilateral organization. Let me just briefly explain what this earmarked funding is. There are, for example, certain trust funds that the multilateral organizations, incidentally, are the World Bank, the IMF, the regional banks such as the Asian Development Bank, the UN agencies, and any UN bodies. These are the principal multilateral organizations. They are given official assistance by the OECD DAC to use the funds wherever they are allowed to use them. In other words, there's no earmarking of those funds. But they are also provided assistance for certain specific activities, like trust funds, for specific purposes. So, for example, there may be a trust fund that's provided specifically for use in a particular country or for a particular activity in a certain group of countries. Those are earmarked funds. And those would not be called multilateral because they're not unearmarked. They would be still counted as bilateral assistance. Just a quick number there. In 2007, the total ODA from the DAC members was approximately $103.7 billion US dollars, of which 32 billion was multilateral and about 71.7 was bilateral. Oops. Something happened, man. No, it's not. I think it's. I've got. There we go. Right. Just a couple of slides over here to show you the shares of multilateral versus bilateral. 2006 and 2007. This is again OECD DAC. It's approximately somewhere in the range of 25 to 31, 32%. Well, 26 in the year 2006, 31% in 2007. So we are talking about multilateral assistance, which is somewhere in the range of a quarter to a third of all official development assistance that's provided by the OECD DAC. Now, what is the principal role of multilateral assistance? Its overarching aim is to reduce poverty and the achievement of the Millennium Development Goals. Issues such as health, gender equality, climate change, and support for fragile states. These are stressed as multilateral priorities. Effectiveness and efficiency are emphasized in engagement with multilaterals, and reform of the multilateral agencies is considered a priority. So when the donors give money to the multilaterals, these are some of the conditions that they impose, that there must be some reform, effectiveness and efficiency must be demonstrated, and so on. The common reasons for and some of the advantages of engagement with multilateral institutions, there's economies of scale. Multilateral institutions are generally much larger. They operate over a large number of countries, and they don't have to have certain problems such as political ambitions. There's political neutrality. They are not supposed to engage in any political activities. So there are none of the bilateral concerns. In other words, there are no strategic interests or foreign policy concerns that the multilateral organizations have. They are made up of board of directors that come from all the member countries. But since the member countries of the multilateral organizations are not just the donors, they're also the borrowing members. So there is a balance in the board. And therefore there is political neutrality. It's also considered that because of economies of scale, there is a lower cost that is imposed upon both the donors that use the multilaterals to give out their funds and on the partner countries that are receiving those funds. There is less of a cost of the transactions that are involved. The categories of multilateral assistance I've already mentioned. There are the multilateral development banks, which include the World Bank and the International Development Association, the World Bank Group. The regional development banks and their soft loan windows. The IDA, incidentally, the International Development Association of the World Bank Group, is the association that provides soft loans. These are basically zero interest loans, and all of the regional development banks also have soft loan windows. The Asian Development Bank, for example, has a soft loan window called the Asian Development Fund, which is equivalent to the IDA. Then there are the agencies, the funds and the commissions of the United Nations, and there is also the European Commission. The European Commission itself, which is made up of all the European Union member states, is a multilateral organization. That's really taking care of the DAC. Now we have, of late and becoming more important in recent years, what we are now calling non-DAC or non-traditional development assistance. There's still some controversy about what term to use. Some people prefer to use the term emerging donors, but many of the donors that are involved here claim that they're not really emerging. They've been around for a long time. So that's not acceptable. Non-DAC kind of sounds hierarchical. It's considered wrong by a lot of people, like it's some kind of a club, DAC, non-DAC, so that's not acceptable. Non-traditional is something that we prefer to use at the Asian Development Bank because it basically is slightly different to what we normally consider to be official development assistance. Now, the non-DAC, non-traditional donors, the principal ones are listed over there. There's Saudi Arabia, for reasons we well know. They have a lot of oil money. There's Iran, there's South Korea, there's India, there's China. There's a lot of the new European Union members. In fact, the United Nations lists over 60 official development assistance donors, of which only 22 are DAC members. So there's over or close to 40 that are non-DAC donors. We won't go into all of those, but they range all the way from Venezuela to Turkey to South Africa to Brazil. They're all over. Thailand, Singapore, Malaysia. These are all donors in some form or the other to some countries. Now, what are the objectives of non-traditional assistance? They're pretty much the same as the others, but there are some basic differences. First of all, these emerging donor development assistance, these programs, what they emphasize are partnerships and South-South cooperation. And South-South cooperation is basically, I'm sure you're familiar with this terminology, it's cooperation between countries of the South. Again, this North-South distinction is again controversial because some countries in the South, like Singapore, are no longer a developing country. Some countries of the North, especially some of the poorer countries in the North, like Mongolia and so on, are part of the South. So it's not clear what exactly this South-South means, but let's use it for the time being. It basically means cooperation amongst developing countries. These emerging donors prefer not to use the traditional donor-recipient kind of hierarchy, which is a sort of a patron-client kind of a relationship. They try to deal with it more as a partnership. And they've always had this tradition. Their programs emphasize mutual benefits, which again contrasts with the traditional donor debate over recipients versus donor interests. Okay, there is again that hierarchy there. Part of it is political, part of it is simply economic. A lot of the donors, traditional donors, use donor assistance as a means to benefit themselves through procurement and other such rules and regulations. Well, dare I say it, use of consultants, for example. Australia provides assistance. It will insist that you hire consultants from Australia. The US will do the same. European countries will do the same. A lot of the non-traditional donors are tending to do the same as well, but not so much. You know, it's less. Emerging donors tend to stress local stability. They are much more interested in local strategic interests. They do not have these larger geographic strategic patterns and ideas in mind. So these are some of the sort of the objectives of non-DAC or non-traditional development assistance. When we talk about this kind of assistance, we have a basic problem. The basic problem is an absence of comprehensive and coherent data. A lot of the data from these sources is not available. If it is available, it is not very reliable. So it's never really clear what kind of numbers we're talking about. In contrast, the assistance that's provided by the DAC is very, very reliable. It's there for everyone to see. Nobody has any questions about it. But in this case, and you will see as I go through some of these numbers over here, you can see why it becomes a little difficult. One, it's because of the range of activities that these countries are involved in. Two, it's also simply because of the countries that are involved. China's level of assistance. China provides both loans and it provides grants. So if you include the loans, which are payable, and they have to be repaid, but they may be soft loans. In other words, they're zero interest loans, as opposed to grants, which are simply giveaway money. China's assistance could be as high as 10 billion. The main areas of support are research, training, human resource development, but a lot of the loans are for partnerships with Chinese enterprises and Chinese companies. So again, there is that gray area where it's difficult to tell what exactly is assistance and what exactly is a business interest. For example, in Africa, China gives a large amount of grants, but it also now has an African assistance program which includes a large number of Chinese companies investing in Africa. Now, is that to be regarded as development assistance, or is that business interests? You know, it becomes a little difficult. India's level of assistance has grown rapidly in the last few years. It's now roughly $1 billion US. The main areas of support for Indian assistance are training and education. But again, of late, it has been involved in direct investments in projects as well, both in this region, in the Asia-Pacific region, but also increasingly in Africa and in Latin America. Now, what is the future role of non-DAC and non-traditional donors? Well, there is a strong feeling that if there is going to be an emergence of these donors and an increase in their numbers, then perhaps they should be working towards precisely the same goals that everyone else is working towards, which is the achievement of the Millennium Development Goals. There should be strengthened support for official development assistance via some kind of international partnerships, through partnership agreements with countries. There's a lot of this happening. In Latin America, we see Brazil and Venezuela, which is an oil-rich country, having a lot of partnerships with its neighbors. We see the same thing with the OPEC countries. And a lot of this aid and assistance comes without any strings attached. So even though there may be other costs involved, a lot of recipient countries prefer getting aid from these donors because they come with very little conditionalities. These new donors are going to be, in the future, one expects that there will be more active representation in international agencies, like, for example, the Asian Development Bank, where we are beginning to get donations and funds given to our Asian Development Fund, for example, from China, from Singapore, from Thailand, and perhaps from India in the near future. So these are going to be, there's going to be greater engagement with international agencies, and there's going to be, of course, some kind of dialogue taking place, and therefore the influence of these non-DAC, non-traditional donors is going to be increasing in the global development agenda. It's probably a bit dull at the moment. We've been talking about all these countries and so on. Let's try and focus in on what exactly is all this assistance for. I mentioned the Millennium Development Goals, the MDGs. What these are, they are goals for the entire world. They're time-bound, they're quantified targets for addressing extreme poverty in many dimensions. There's income poverty, which is very simple. You can talk about the $1 income a day or $2 income a day. That's sort of extreme poverty. We're talking about hunger. We're talking about disease. We're talking about lack of adequate shelter. We're talking about exclusion. That's marginalized groups, gender equality. We're talking about education. We're talking about environmental sustainability. These are basically the broad ideas behind the Millennium Development Goals. How did they become the Millennium Development Goals? They were the internationally accepted goals for development at the UN Millennium Summit, which was in the year 2000, September 2000, all the countries of the United Nations got together and they accepted the Millennium Development Goals as the goals for the entire world. This was the UN Millennium Declaration. There are 8 goals, very simply: eradicate extreme poverty and hunger, achieve universal primary education, promote gender equality and empower women, reduce child mortality, improve maternal health, combat HIV/AIDS, malaria and other diseases. When I say other diseases, we're mainly talking about tuberculosis and the main infectious diseases. Ensure environmental sustainability, and the last of the goals, which is really very important to the kind of things we're talking about today, is to develop a global partnership for development, a global partnership that includes both the developed and the developing countries. So it's not just a patron-client relationship, it's a partnership relationship. Now, these are the broad goals. It's not easy to define them. It's not easy to set targets and indicators. There are sets of indicators and sets of targets for each of the goals. There are 21 targets and there are 60 indicators. Not easy, very complicated, and very controversial in some cases. I won't go into all of those, but what I suggest you do is, in the handout that I've given, there is a reference to some websites which deal with the Millennium Development Goals, and you'll find all the references and definitions, indicators, targets, etc. over there. And some of those references are specific to what's been happening in the Asia and Pacific region. What I'll do is I'll just very briefly, to give you some idea of what the enormity of the problem is and why we are so concerned about this issue. Where are we in the Asia and Pacific region when it comes to most of these goals? Just give you some highlights of these numbers. Goal 1, which is extreme poverty and hunger. Most of Asians, again, sorry for using these acronyms. ADB, you know what ADB is. DMCs is developing member countries of the ADB. So most of ADB's developing member countries are on track to achieve this goal. Incidentally, the target date for the MDGs is 2015. Now, for example, when we talk about extreme poverty and hunger, it's not a very ambitious target. What it says is that between 1990 and 2015, we will reduce by half the number of people living in extreme poverty. We're not going to get rid of extreme poverty. We're only going to reduce the number by half. So we're only going to get rid of 50% of the extreme poverty. It's a very, very unambitious goal. Now, most of ADB's developing member countries are on track to achieve this goal. However, about 1.9 billion people in the Asia and Pacific region still live on less than $2 a day. Think about that. $2 a day. $2 a day is how many Sing dollars? I don't know, 2.6, is it? Think about it. Just try and live on 2.6 Sing dollars a day. There's 1.9 billion people living on less than $2 a day, and over 620 million on less than $1 a day. Now, that number has been reduced from 947.5 million in 1990 to 620, so we're pretty much on track to meet the target over the next, 7 years? 7 years. We've reduced it by about 327.5 million. That's pretty good. If we can keep this going, we'll have reached the target. Goal 2, globally, the total number of children of primary school age who were out of school fell from 103 million in 1999 to 75 million in 2006. This is despite an overall increase in the number of children in this age group. Now, in Asia, most of the region has achieved this goal. In Southern Asia, the ratio has climbed to 90%. So we still don't have universal primary education, but it's likely that we're going to achieve it even in Southern Asia, which is lagging far behind the rest of the region. Goal 3, the Asia-Pacific economies have already achieved the target for gender equality in primary school enrollment. A slightly lower number have done so in secondary school enrollment, while even fewer have done so in tertiary education enrollment. So we're still doing pretty much okay, but we still have a lot of work to do. Again, Southern Asia is where a lot of the problem lies. Goal 4, 10 Asian Pacific economies are expected to achieve the target for child mortality by 2015, but 15, including 2 of the most populous, no prizes for guessing which they are, they're unlikely to do so. That's India and China. Goal 5, in the Asia and Pacific region, maternal mortality can range from as low as 1 in Hong Kong, China, to as high as 1,800 in Afghanistan for 100,000 live births. Now that's an enormous variation. So 1 woman dies in childbirth out of 100,000 in Hong Kong, China, 1,800 die in Afghanistan. And that's a year, per year. So we're not talking about over any number of years. That's every year. So that's a large number. In most of the other economies, the number is less than 150 women that die in childbirth out of 100,000. Goal 6, for the Asia-Pacific economies for which data are available, less than 1% of the population is reported to be suffering from HIV. Malaria, however, is highly prevalent in a few countries, particularly in the Pacific. Most economies have been very successful in reducing the spread of tuberculosis, but infection rates are rising in 7 of the Central and West Asian economies. These are countries like the Kyrgyz Republic, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Azerbaijan, Armenia, and so on. It includes Afghanistan as well. But by and large, for most of the region, I think this goal is pretty much on track. Goal 7, Asia and the Pacific accounts for 75% of the world's rural population. Now we know about the Asian miracle, and we know about how wonderfully Asia is doing, but all we see are buildings and cities. 75% of the world's rural population are still in the Asia-Pacific region. That's a huge number. And 63% of the urban population do not have access to safe sanitation. That's 1.9 billion people do not have access to safe water or to sanitation. This is a goal we are not going to achieve. It's impossible to achieve in the next 8 years unless we pour in billions and billions and billions of dollars in assistance. The final goal, which is on partnerships, this is a little more difficult to kind of pin down, but I've tried to do that. The debt problems of developing countries need to be addressed. There's a large debt problem, but they need to be addressed through global partnerships. It's not going to happen country to country. It's going to be addressed through some kind of global partnerships. Debt has to be made sustainable in the long term. It's a big issue, especially for African countries. It's not such a big issue. You might have heard of the term HIPC, HIPC, highly indebted partner countries. Yeah, or highly indebted poor countries. We don't like to use the term poor. Some people find it offensive. But the HIPC countries, we don't have too many in the Asia-Pacific region. Lao PDR, perhaps. Nepal, perhaps. They're still arguing whether they want to be included or not. Some of the Pacific islands, but not generally otherwise. But Africa has a large number of highly indebted poor countries. But debt has to be made sustainable in the long term, and that's got to be done through global partnerships. Official development assistance reached a peak all-time high of 107.1 billion in 2005. It dropped to 103.7 billion in 2007. This despite the fact that the world pledged to increase development assistance. There is a pledge, for example, by the OECD DAC countries to have 0.7% of their GDP provided as official development assistance. That's only 0.7%, less than 1% of their GDP. There's only 5 countries that have reached that target. And most of those countries are Northern European countries. In fact, I think all of them are. The list is somewhere in the notes that you've got. All the others are way below, and most of them are less than 0.3% of GDP. The relative weight of debt servicing, that's the service that has to be paid, the interest that has to be paid on all the debt, has been falling since 1990 in most of the Asia-Pacific economies where such data are available. So we've got some pretty insurmountable problems, some pretty bad issues to deal with, some very, very difficult issues to deal with. The income poverty, as I said, on the MDGs is likely to be achieved. It's the non-income ones that are going to be more difficult. Now, the numbers that I've given you these are average numbers for the Asia-Pacific region. This does not tell you the variation in many of these countries. For example, there are some countries that are way beyond the target. There are others which are way below the target and are not likely to achieve it. So individually, there are still going to be many countries in the region that are not going to achieve gender equality, for example, that are not going to achieve universal education, that are not going to achieve maternal mortality rates that are acceptable, or child mortality rates that are acceptable. But on average, the Asia-Pacific region is likely to achieve several of those, but it's the non-income ones that are difficult. And like I said, things like access to safe water, access to sanitation, these are unlikely to be achieved. And these are very, very major issues when it comes to poverty reduction. Poverty reduction is not just having money in your pocket. It's about leading a healthy and better life. Now, the question that's been asked on aid effectiveness, I really have no idea how I'm doing for time. I'm doing okay? Okay, good. The question that's been asked, has aid been effective in reducing poverty? And there are, of course, as you would obviously guess, there are opposing arguments. There is the pro-aid argument and there is the anti-aid argument. The pro-aid argument basically says that, yes, look, we may not have done as well as we could have, but without aid, we would be far worse off. The anti-aid argument is a little stronger, frankly. I shouldn't be saying it. I work for an aid agency, but it is a little stronger because basically, if you look at the numbers, $2.3 trillion have been given in assistance, in development assistance over the last 50 years. $2.3 trillion. And we still are talking about large instances of poverty, large numbers of people living below the poverty line. So the question that's asked is, what's gone wrong with all that assistance? Where has all that assistance gone? And why has it not helped the poor? Well, there are all kinds of issues. There are governance issues, which we won't need to go into. Governance is a euphemism for what we commonly call corruption. The big C word, which for many years, many countries in our region would not allow us to use that word. Need I mention those countries? No, I don't think I will. I'll get into trouble. But that's been a big issue. And the issue has been that a lot of this money has gone to corrupt governments in a lot of poor countries that have wasted those funds and have not utilized the funds for what they were given, which is basically poverty reduction. So the money has not really reached the poor. Now, what are the weaknesses of aid? Some of the arguments that have been given, and I was talking to Charles earlier, and he mentioned two names, Easterly and Sachs, and I said I wasn't going to mention the names, but these are some of the arguments that these gentlemen have also made. For example, Sachs has said somewhere, and I'm pretty sure he's the one who did say this, that overall poverty cannot be ended by a comprehensive package of things like malaria medicines and clean water. That's just not it. It's got to be more than just that. It's not things that you provide. There's got to be some sustainability. There's got to be some continuity. There's got to be some way in which people become self-sufficient and they can support themselves. So it's not handouts. It's not charity. The other argument that's made to show the weakness of aid is that it's given to governments. A lot of the governments that receive this have central planning systems. Planners, which sit in offices in capitals, at the top somewhere, they don't have enough feedback from the poor. They don't have incentives for implementation. There is no accountability. And that's a very, very important issue. Accountability for the results to make the plans that they have work. So if the plans don't work, nobody's held accountable. And they go and make a new plan. They say, well, that didn't work, let's try a new one. So accountability is a big issue. And trying to manage for results is a big issue. There's a weak link between spending and the results you achieve. While, for example, it's been estimated that anywhere from 30% to 70% of government-provided medicines disappeared before reaching patients in surveys of low-income aid recipients. These were surveys, independent surveys done in African countries, in Asian countries. Anywhere from 30 to 70% of the medicines never reached the people they were intended to reach. Nobody knows where they went. They were probably sold on the open market or on the black market or somewhere, but they certainly didn't reach the people they were intended to reach. This is just one example. So there's no link between the spending and the results. Again, an accountability issue. And finally, what I've already said, nobody has been held accountable for any of the failures. So that's the main issue that we're dealing with. Now, because of these issues and because these questions were being raised very loudly by some very influential people, a lot of them academics, a lot of them politicians, parliamentarians, people in government, elected representatives in many countries were asking these questions, both in the recipient countries and in the donor countries were asking these questions. Where is our money going? Why is the money not making any impact? Well, this led to global efforts to make aid effective. Now, the global efforts were essentially dealing with problems and challenges that I've already mentioned. First of all, the amounts. There were large amounts of assistance being given. There were a large number of donors. In fact, too many. I can give you some very stark examples. I think Vietnam likes to give this example that they have so many donors there, or they had so many donors at one point in time, that they had, I think, 659 different missions per year. That's more than an average of about 2 a day. So if government officials are dealing with 2 donor missions every day, when do they get time to do any work? Nepal, a small country like Nepal, had something like 700 missions in 1 year. Lao PDR, Cambodia, where you have 60 or 80 or 75 or something different donors operating or different agencies operating in these small little countries. So not only are we talking about numbers, but we have what we call the lack of harmonization. Each of these donors had their own rules and regulations, their own procedures, their own practices, their own documentation, and everyone was insisting that the governments do things their way. So there was no harmonization between the donor community. Each one had different requirements. Simply this, the transaction costs of this assistance was being provided was incredibly high. So there was a need to reduce the transactions costs. That's the transaction of just getting assistance. It took them hours and hours to fill in those forms and to get things done. The World Bank had its rules, the ADB had its rules, the UN agency had its rules, the government of Japan had its own rules, etc., etc., etc. These are procurement guidelines, these are financial regulations, these are audit requirements, these are accounting requirements, and so on. All of them saying that they were following international standards, but no harmonization between them. There was also a need to ensure country ownership, which basically meant that was the country really responsible for its own development agenda? Or was this a development agenda that was being dictated to them by the donor recipients, in which case each donor country would have its own agenda that it was trying to push in the recipient country. So where was the country ownership? Whose development agenda was it? And then finally, there was a need to demonstrate results, because people were asking questions. For example, if you were a US congressman, your voters, when you went up for election, today is the election in the US, would ask you, where is all our money going to? And why is there so much poverty in Africa when you guys are giving billions and billions of dollars each year to Africa in assistance? Why is this money being wasted? Why are you giving it to corrupt dictators and corrupt governments? Well, they had to answer those questions, and so you had to demonstrate results. These were the challenges. What was the response? Well, first of all, the bilateral donors, the OECD DAC, said, well, we've got to do something about it because we're in deep trouble at home. We're not going to get re-elected. Purely self-interest. Biggest motivation for humankind, self-interest. Then there were the multilateral development banks like the ADB or the World Bank. We were under pressure from our donors, people who give us money, saying we're not going to give you any money unless you can demonstrate results to us. Show us where you're effective, why you're effective, and what you have done, what you have achieved. So we were facing a big problem from our donors. Well, the OECD DAC got together, and the MDB, the multilateral development banks, they had set up what they call technical working groups in all these different areas: procurement, financial management, auditing, accounting, environment, gender equality, etc., etc. There were working groups trying to see how the MDBs and the OECD DAC countries could harmonize amongst themselves, try to come to some agreement. Well, you know, the World Bank and the ADB, for example, work in the same countries in the Asia-Pacific region. Let's say we are assisting Vietnam. Why does the World Bank have different procurement requirements and we have different procurement requirements? Surely we are following the same standards and principles. We can come to some agreement with the government and say we'll follow your procurement requirements as long as your procurement requirements meet some international standards, so we can all have the same documentation. One document for every donor, for all the donors. Harmonization, simple. We have fiscal year for the ADB. India has its own fiscal year. India's fiscal year goes from April 1 to March 31. ADB's fiscal years goes from January 1 to December 31. We follow our fiscal year, India follows its fiscal year. Why should we follow our fiscal year? We're giving money to India for India, not for ourselves. We better align ourselves to India's fiscal year. And we better align our strategies and our policies to what India's development goals are, as an example. And this was simply the question of alignment. Aligning donor strategies and donor policies, whatever they may be. Our primary goal is eradication of poverty, the ADBs. Our mission and vision is to see a region free of poverty. Well, that's very simple, but we can align that with a country like India or Bangladesh or Cambodia or Lao PDR or Indonesia or any number of countries. We can align our goals with the goals of that country. We can assist them where they are working on poverty reduction issues. It's not that difficult. It's very simple and very straightforward. We have country strategies for each country that we operate in. Our country strategies should be aligned to the National Development Agenda. This became the concept of alignment. So we started harmonizing practices, procedures, and policies amongst the donors. We started aligning with country development agendas. We started improving donor coordination and we started what we call Managing for Development Results. Nice new acronym, MFDR. Okay, you'll see it coming up, so I'm warning you in advance. You'll see something called MFDR, so you'll know what it is. So that was the response. And this started happening in the late 90s and the early part of this century. What we started doing, let me go back, I don't want to distract you with this one. What we started doing was, we started working in this region, the ADB, and the World Bank, and the government of Japan, and several other principal donors, and in countries in Africa, and in countries in Latin America, and we started asking for volunteer countries where we could pilot test these harmonized practices and policies and procedures, where we could align with national development agendas, where we could try harmonized environmental assessments or social impact assessments, do joint portfolio reviews. Each one of us has a portfolio in a particular country. We do a portfolio review of all ADB projects in Vietnam, for example. So does the World Bank, so does the government of Japan. Why can't we do joint portfolio reviews? Go once to the government all together and say, look, we'd like to see all the projects that you guys are doing, and we'll do a review of all of them jointly. So who volunteered from the Asia-Pacific region? The first two countries that volunteered were Vietnam and the Philippines. And so we started these harmonization and alignment pilot testing in these two countries. It was initially the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, and the government of Japan. Then we were joined by several other donors. In Vietnam, it became the 5 banks group, which included Japan, JBIC, the Japan Bank for International Cooperation, ADB, World Bank, the KfW, which I believe is Germany, and France. These 5 banks in Vietnam. In the Philippines, it was a different combination. And then slowly we started getting other countries. Papua New Guinea, for example, Bangladesh, Cambodia, Lao PDR, the Kyrgyz Republic, they all started volunteering for this exercise. This was prior to 2003. In 2003, we had what became known as the Rome High-Level Forum on Harmonization. It's actually the Rome High-Level Forum on Harmonization and Alignment, but I think for reasons of space, we left out the alignment. But it was the Rome High-Level Forum on Harmonization and Alignment, which is now known as the first High-Level Forum. This took place in Rome, in Italy, 24-25 February 2003. Now, what was the purpose of this? The main purpose of this was to bring together all the donor agencies and organizations and countries and the partner countries, which is the recipient countries, bring them together and to see how jointly they can improve the management and effectiveness of aid. So this was really the first high-level forum, international high-level forum on aid effectiveness. What they decided to do was take stock of the progress that had been made through these pilot testing, what kind of things had been achieved, and how they could take this agenda forward to try and contribute to meeting the MDGs, achieving the MDGs. What was the main outcome of the Rome Declaration? Of the Rome Forum? It was something called the Rome Declaration on Harmonization and Alignment. All the countries that were there, they pledged to do the following. But these were just pledges. In other words, they were good intentions. They would adapt, all the donors would adapt to the country context, and they would align with the country's priorities. Okay? Now, there are provisos, and we can get into that during the question and answer. Thank you. Streamlining of donor procedures and practices, adapting institutions and the donor countries' policies, procedures, and practices to facilitate harmonization. I've already mentioned some of these things. And to implement good practice principles and standards as the foundation for this harmonization. So this was what the Rome Declaration said. It basically said that we're all going to get together and we're going to do this. that's when a lot of the work that's going on now actually started. From Rome to Paris, you're wondering why Paris? Well, we'll soon find out. The OECD DAC set up what they call the Working Party on Aid Effectiveness and Donor Practices. And under that, there were several joint ventures. There was a joint venture on procurement, joint venture on financial management, a joint venture on managing for development results, and so on. Okay? And these were all designed to facilitate, support, and monitor progress on harmonization and alignment, to establish priorities, and carry out cross-cutting work. Cross-cutting work, a euphemism, it deals with gender issues, cross-cutting, environmental issues, cross-cutting, it cuts across everything, and so on. So these joint ventures and the working party was made up of not just the donor countries, but also partner countries, the recipient countries, and of all the multilaterals. So the World Bank, the regional banks, the UN agencies were all members of this working party, and they all would sit down together and they would start working, and they started working on these issues. And then task forces were set up to deal with these issues, and a lot of work was done on this. The MDB technical working group started assisting in this process, and there was something called the MDB Roundtable. The MDB Roundtable used to meet once every year to look at progress on harmonization amongst the multilateral development banks. It started meeting twice a year, just to make sure that work was speeded up and so on. That's what they started doing, and they started coordinating all the harmonization efforts. So a lot of work was being done. And this work was then taken up at the second high-level forum, which finally got the name of Aid Effectiveness, HLF2. This was in Paris, 28th February to the 2nd of March, 2005. The main purpose of this activity was part of the global effort to move towards achieving the MDGs by using aid resources more effectively, to promote sustainable, broad-based growth and poverty reduction. This was the main purpose of the Paris High-Level Forum, the second High-Level Forum. The forum reviewed the progress that had been made in harmonization, on alignment, on managing for results, and it charted a course for the coming years. There were over 100 ministers from developing and developed countries, finance ministers generally, or ministers of the planning agencies. There were the heads of all the multilateral and the bilateral development institutions, and there were many other senior officials. So there was a very, very large representation over here. And the main outcome of this meeting was something that came to be known as the Paris Declaration on Aid Effectiveness. Now, the Paris Declaration on Aid Effectiveness covered 5 important issues. First of all, and the primary issue, was ownership. We've already mentioned that. Country ownership and leadership of the development agenda. How to achieve that. Alignment between the donors and the providers of assistance and the recipients, the partner countries. Harmonization amongst all the donors. Managing for development results. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, mutual accountability. So the donors are accountable not just to their stakeholders, which is basically their people, their populations, but they're also, to some extent, accountable to the people they're giving money to, because they don't want to waste those resources, so they can be asked those questions. So it's a mutual accountability. And the recipients have to be accountable to someone. Where is that money going to? Why is it not reaching the poor, and so on? So there has to be some kind of mutual accountability. Not very easy to manage, not very easy to define, but the principle was there. So these were the 5 basic principles. Why was it very different, and why was Paris so significant? Well, first of all, the declaration went beyond any previous agreements. It was the first time that there were specific indicators, specific targets, and specific goals set for each of the 5 principles. There were 12 indicators that were identified to monitor progress, and there were timelines. There were targets set the year 2010. So for the first time, both donors and partner countries were to be held accountable in terms of achieving progress according to specific targets and specific indicators. And there were mechanisms for accountability that were addressed for the very first time. Again, from Paris to Accra. Well, you can guess, right, what happened in Accra, the third high-level forum. What happened between Paris and Accra? Accra took place just a couple of months ago, beginning of September. The OECD started doing surveys on monitoring the Paris Declaration. They did a first round of monitoring in 2006 of 34 countries. It was a baseline survey, just to set baselines. Second round of monitoring took place in 2008, which covered 54 countries around the world, of which 11 were from the Asia-Pacific region, just to see what progress is being made on all those 12 indicators. The OECD DAC has an evaluation network. It started doing an international independent evaluation of the Paris Declaration commitments amongst both the partner countries and the donor community. Again, this was a survey. It was not all donor countries, all partner countries. It was not even a survey, let's put it this way. It was, again, volunteers. They asked for countries who would volunteer to be evaluated. So there's a bit of a bias, as you can know. I mean, anybody who's a statistician here would know that there is an immediate bias there. Only countries that are doing relatively well would volunteer. Okay, if you're not really doing too well, you probably wouldn't volunteer. Although, mind you, Asian Development Bank volunteered. We didn't know if you were doing well or not. We just volunteered. We might have been reckless, but we did. And so we were part of this evaluation thing. But, for example, the African Development Bank did not volunteer. The World Bank did. The Inter-American Bank did not. But there were many other countries that did volunteer and so on. The first phase of that evaluation has been completed. The other thing that started happening was the Paris Declaration is a generic document. It is for all countries across the entire world. There was a need to localize that, to make it relevant to the country context. So the localization of the Paris Declaration started taking place in different ways based on the country context. And I'll give you some examples of the Asia-Pacific region. For example, in Vietnam, they came up with what they call the Hanoi Core Statement, which was the Vietnamese version of the Paris Declaration, what the Paris Declaration targets and indicators and commitments meant in the context of Vietnam. Cambodia has its own Cambodia Declaration. Lao PDR has the Vientiane Declaration on aid effectiveness. These they didn't all happen at once. Some happened earlier, some happened a little later, but these have all been happening over the last couple of years. The Pacific Island countries jointly came up with the Pacific Principles on aid effectiveness, because they're such small countries, it's very difficult for each one of them to have their own specific idea on what the declaration means to them. So they came up with a Pacific regional perspective on aid effectiveness. The Philippines, for example, it had its own version, and then it started implementing that through a technical assistance project where they started capacity development programs to look at each one of the 5 pillars. The Kyrgyz Republic started doing joint country support strategies where they started bringing in all the donor community to work jointly with the government on developing a support strategy. So different countries had different ways of addressing the localization of Paris. These were some of the main things that took place. 2nd to 4th September this year, the 3rd High-Level Forum on Aid Effectiveness took place in Accra, Ghana. The main purpose, to take stock of progress in implementing the Paris Declaration and to plan the continued efforts and how to intensify them. How did it take stock of this progress? Through the monitoring survey and through the first phase evaluation. How did it plan to intensify efforts? Through what came to be known as the Accra Agenda for Action, which is the main outcome. It's the official communique that came out of Accra. The attendance, this time there were 130 partner and donor countries, ministers and parliamentarians, which weren't there in Paris. There's Big difference between ministers and parliamentarians. Not all ministers are necessarily parliamentarians. Some ministers in some countries are just appointed. Like, for example, in the US, the Secretary of State is appointed by the President. He's not an elected representative, right? Whereas in other countries, the Secretary of State would be a parliamentarian. So we had parliamentarians in Accra. There were 40 international bilateral and multilateral development organizations. There were representatives from 80 civil society organizations. And there were over 100 representatives from the private sector, think tanks, research institutions, and foundations. 26 partner countries from the Asia and Pacific region were represented there. In all, there were more than 1,500 people. It was a huge event. Almost unmanageable, but full marks to the government of Ghana and the organizers. Well, we were one of the organizers. But we contributed less than some of the other organizers. They did a terrific job. Managing 1,500 delegates over 3 days was not easy, but they did it. The Accra Agenda for Action, very briefly, it addressed, it basically, first of all, it endorsed the Paris Declaration. It said the Paris Declaration has been effective, and it has worked towards making aid more effective. But there are some major challenges. And the major challenges that they identified, that it identifies, one, enhancing country ownership. They said we haven't made enough progress on country ownership. Two, we need to build more effective and more inclusive partnerships. So the partnership issue was very important. And third, achieving development results and being accountable for them must become the centerpiece of all activities. So these were the three major actions advocated in the Accra Agenda. And then there are several actions and activities that are specified in the document on how you can actually go about achieving these. Further, what it did was it looked very closely at the changing aid effectiveness agenda. And we've already talked about that at great length earlier, which was the emerging donors, the non-traditional donors, the non-DAC donors, the expanding aid effectiveness agenda. What does that mean to the whole program of assistance? Most of them, for example, had not signed on to the Paris Declaration as a donor. They had signed on as recipient countries. Will they follow those as donors as well? The same principles. What they follow as partner countries, as recipients, they must follow as donors as well. Issues such as gender, the environment, HIV/AIDS, and human rights as part of the aid effectiveness agenda. How do you link these? The concept of ownership broadening to democratic ownership. Who are the stakeholders in a particular country? Is it just the governments? Is it civil society? Is it the private sector? Who is it? Who exactly are the stakeholders? So a broadening of the concept of ownership. These were all the issues that are addressed in the Accra Agenda for Action. And it specifies very concrete steps going forward. Well, I think I've run out of time, but just a minute's plug for the ADB. We've been working on all of these areas. There it is for you to see. In fact, before Paris, right after Rome, we put together an action plan for harmonization, alignment, and ownership, where we started asking all of our operational departments and all of our country offices to start giving us their views on how they were promoting harmonization, alignment, and ownership in the country that they were working in. So this action plan is updated every 6 months. We came up with an MFDR, a Managing for Development Results action plan. How are we going to measure development results? Not in terms of outputs, but in terms of outcomes. Outcomes measured in terms of poverty reduction, MDGs, etc., etc. Not in terms of income levels and, those kind of national income accounting numbers, but more in terms of poverty statistics. We started assisting the partner countries in localizing the Paris Declaration. This was after Paris. We started incorporating the Paris principles within our operations in the bank and in our strategic planning. In other words, in our country programs, in our country strategies, our country plans. We started incorporating ownership, alignment, harmonization, accountability, etc., etc. We started conducting our own monitoring surveys. Using the OECD's methodology, we started conducting our own monitoring surveys on the implementation of Paris within ADB. And our two surveys we've done, the first one covered 13 countries, the second one, which has just been completed, covered 17. We're doing reasonably well, although there are some areas of weakness. As I've said already, we volunteered for this independent evaluation, and we are now doing, for the first time, what we call an annual development effectiveness review. In other words, we are looking at our programs, all of our operations, and we're trying to see, as best we can, how we are contributing to the development of each of our member countries. So we are doing development effectiveness briefs for each individual country that we operate in, and then we're using all that information to come up with an overall development annual review for the bank as a whole. Well, finally, the conclusions. These are the big issues. It's not just the volume of aid that's important, it's the quality of aid that is important. That's why we're talking about aid effectiveness, and that's where it fits into the whole idea of development assistance. Aid effectiveness must be central to the entire development agenda. We can criticize where aid has failed, and we really need to do that, but we also need to build on rather than just dismiss where it has succeeded and where new initiatives have shown promise. In other words, we need to learn from the best examples we had and the best practices we have. We need to allocate more aid to countries that are implementing sensible development strategies and are seriously committed to development. Now, this is a very controversial issue. I put it up there because I think it's important to state that. It's the governance issues. Because countries that are not doing well, should they or should they not get aid? Maybe they're not doing well, but they deserve the aid because they can do better. So the idea is, again, to move towards partnerships. Importantly, aid agencies need to move from a one-size-fits-all kind of approach, and they need to work differently in different countries. Okay, so you need to look at the country context very carefully, and that, I think, is very important to make aid effective. Aid agencies need to set very clear goals for their projects and programs. They need to announce these publicly. In other words, there needs to be full transparency on what we do and how we do it and why we do it. We need to be evaluated independently on our progress. We don't have to evaluate ourselves. We need to have independent evaluations because, it's like asking, say, the police force to evaluate itself, and they'll always tell you, oh, they've done so well. Or, you ask, if I ask you how well are you doing, there's a tendency for you to think you're doing better than you really are. So independent evaluation. And only when we have all of these things in place, then we'll have the right incentives for success. We can learn better what works, what doesn't work, and why it works. And that's what it's all about. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for an extremely interesting and useful presentation, which I think raises a lot of issues and questions which I'm sure people will want to follow up on. If you could give your name and affiliation when you ask. Over here.
Hello, my name is Jong. I'm senior MPP. My question is about aid effectiveness. You mentioned about the mutual accountability and harmonization and ownership, etc. But I think the fundamental weakness of aid is the political intention. Whether the donor country have the conditionality or not, is basically there's always political intention. That is the fundamental weakness. So I think that the most important thing to improve aid effectiveness is to improve institutional ability, which is available to implement policy. So I think you didn't mention about the institutional approach, detail. I mean, you mentioned about partnership and what's that, country contact. I think it's a bit related to the institutional approach, but I just want to hear about the institutional thing.
Do you want to maybe take 2 or 3 questions in a go? And
Hi, John Roberts, Junior MPP. You mentioned the figure that 2.3 trillion was the amount of total ODA over the past 15 years. When you look at 5-0, even better. When you look at the total, that sounds like a large number. But when you look at the actual impact that has on a lot of countries, so I just did a little research, and these are IMF and OECD statistics. One of the top 20 recipients of this was Bangladesh. And in 2002, they got around $1 trillion. That's $6 a person. How much are we really expecting from $6 a person in a country like Bangladesh?
Hi, my name is Zahid. Okay, my question is about the approach that all of these development agencies take with regards to dealing only with government agencies. So, for example, I worked in the earthquake areas of Pakistan, the 2005 earthquake in Kashmir. The World Bank gave a lot of aid for the redevelopment of that area, but they dealt specifically with the Earthquake Reconstruction and Rehabilitation Authority of the government of Pakistan. Now, the people of that region had a lot of issues with the way this whole process was taking place. Do you think the aid can be effective if this sort of approach continues? And are there any further developments to this issue?
one more question.
Yes, we will.
Hi, my name is Amrita. I was just wondering, you mentioned the Millennium Development Goals, and we know that we're going to take care of the first goal of reducing poverty by 2015, because 2 countries, India and China, have managed to reduce their poverty substantially. Now, that's happened partly because, or largely because, they both had very, very high levels of growth over the past 2 decades now. So I'm wondering, how much does aid have to do with this? And then coming back to the ODA bit, if we're really seeing India and China doing so well, and especially in Africa, we don't see as much poverty reduction in many countries. It's seen a rise in poverty. Do you think this business-linked model of aid, or what China is doing in Africa, can be effective? Business aid can be more effective than aid in a conventional sense?
Good. That's a very good list of questions. I'll see if I can address all of them. I think I can. The first one on conditionality and the political dimensions of aid. I think that's very important. It's extremely important, in fact. Now, we didn't get into the details, but if you look at the work that's being done on country ownership, for example, and on alignment, most of the debate is around this political economy dimension of aid, which is around conditionality. The concept of ownership is very closely linked to the concept of conditionality. Second point I want to make is, and I'll just elaborate further. Second point I want to make is the difference between bilateral assistance and multilateral assistance. I mentioned that right at the very beginning, that multilateral assistance has this certain advantage. It is non-political to that extent. So the conditionalities that we impose are non-political conditionalities. They are conditionalities that are of necessity, at best economic, or rather, let me put it this, at worst economic conditionalities, which we are trying to reduce even further as we go along, as we align more and more. Bilateral donors, on the other hand, do not have that luxury. First of all, in your notes you'll notice I mentioned that in most places, in most countries, donor countries, it's the ministries of finance that handle ODA. But in many others, it is the Ministry of Foreign Affairs that also handles official development assistance. You'll ask yourself, well, what has foreign affairs got to do with official development assistance? Well, that's the political dimension. They're doing it for strategic interests. And so there is a political conditionality involved. I'll give you an example. perhaps not the best example, but I'll try not to mention any country. A particular country in a particular recipient country had this to say: we don't care about we sign on to these declarations internationally, but we don't really give a damn. And I'm being very polite. The term that was used was much ruder. We don't give a damn about harmonization. We want to see our flag on every, what currency should I use? Every rupee we spend. It wasn't a rupee, I assure you. And so that's the reality. That's what they said. We want everyone who receives that money from us to know where it's coming from. Well, where's the harmonization and where's the alignment? So we have this big problem. And one of the biggest issues that the Accra Agenda for Action tries to address is this concept of ownership, and it addresses this precisely in terms of conditionality. So you are very right to bring up this issue, political conditionality in particular. When are we going to put down our flags and say this money is going for altruistic purposes, not to promote our own agenda, but to actually help the recipient country? May not ever happen. Maybe not in this day and age, maybe not in our generation, or maybe not even certainly not in my lifetime or our lifetime, perhaps not even in your lifetime. Let's hope not. But we're trying to move there, and that's the big issue. You mentioned institutional ability. Right from the very start, I haven't mentioned it in I think it's a shortcoming. You'll see it mentioned in the notes that I've handed out. The issue is of capacity development. Without developing capacity and developing institutions, we will never be able to have countries manage their own development agenda. So the biggest issue to date has been capacity development. Now, the sad truth is that every year, close to $7 billion are spent internationally on capacity development programs. That's the total amount of assistance that we, the ADB, gives out in loans every year. $7 billion is spent entirely on capacity development worldwide. And that's all grant assistance. It's not loans, it's grant assistance. That's a huge number. And yet, today, the Accra Agenda for Action recognizes that capacity development is the single most important problem that we are facing. In other words, institutional capacity is sorely lacking. Now, we have addressed this issue as best we can through country contexts and country programs, and we are trying to develop capacity development programs and institutional capacity programs that are not just country-specific, but are geared on the needs and demands of the country itself. So in other words, these will not be donor-imposed. And we are basically, as multilaterals, we are encouraging countries to resist and reject any capacity program that they are given that does not fulfill their needs and requirements and demands. So it has to be demand-based, it has to be needs-based, and there has to be a needs assessment done before capacity development programs are. The other thing, and one of the main indicators of the Paris Declaration, is what we call parallel project implementation units. These are implementation units that are parallel to the existing institutions. In other words, they're outside of the main institutions. And one of the indicators and targets for the Paris Declaration is to reduce as much as possible, reduce by 2/3 the number of these parallel implementation units. In other words, they must be integrated within the existing institutions. And that's the only way you can develop institutions, is by using country systems themselves and country institutions. That's the only way. It's the chicken and egg problem. A lot of the donors, and I can name countries, Japan, the US in particular, the two major donors in the world, they're the single largest providers of assistance to OECD DAC. Both say that we are reluctant and hesitant to use country systems till country systems become good enough and reach certain international standards. Well, the countries say, start using our systems, and only then will they improve to international standards. So what do you do? Do you wait for them to come up to an international standard, which they might never reach without the right kind of assistance? Or do you start using them and start improving them by using them? It's a big debate, but countries like the United Kingdom, for example, UK DFID, has already started using country systems and helping them improve from within. So this big debate is going on. And finally, through the Accra Agenda for Action, all countries agreed that we must have it needs-based and demand-based. And we must start using the country systems wherever possible and whenever possible. So that's a big, big change. 2.3 trillion in 50 years. You're absolutely right. And if you look at my notes, one of the main points I make there is that it may sound like a lot, but it is not a lot. Per capita, it is a very small amount. And the question is, it's like I said, it is not charity. So it's not giving $6 to each individual person. It's not going to do anything. The idea is to create the right incentives and to create the mechanisms by which they can lift themselves out of poverty. So you create opportunities, which leads us to the last question. I'll deal with the earthquake question at the end. I think that's a very important one. But the question that was asked about the MDGs being achieved, is it due to aid or is it because of other reasons? I mean, India, China, huge growth rates, not necessarily because of aid. Perhaps, definitely not because of aid, perhaps because of other reasons. Is that the way out? Or is there some other way? Is what China doing in Africa the right way to go about doing it? You know, creating incentives, creating the environment, and so on. Well, there's no reason why official development assistance cannot be utilized to promote those activities. If, for example, we believe or we accept that the private sector is the single largest or single most efficient engine of growth, and growth is the best way of reducing poverty, let's stretch the argument, which is what the young lady over there suggested, and many of us would probably accept that. How do we promote that growth? Well, there's no reason why official development assistance cannot be utilized to promote the private sector and private sector growth that is inclusive, that is redistributive. Let me use that word. It's not a very popular word these days because John McCain might call me a socialist. You create wealth, you don't distribute it. Let's not get into that argument. I have strong views on that. So how do we do it? We can create an inducive environment, a conducive environment where we can promote policies and promote governments to accept reforms that will allow growth to take place. And growth that allows inclusivity, that does not marginalize women, does not marginalize certain groups in society, that allows opportunities for all, and so on and so forth. And that's where official development assistance can play a major role. Because ours are public funds. They are not there for profit motive. We do not make money out of our loans. All of our loans are then put back into our pool of resources and given back to the countries. So we are not a profit-making organization. Donor agencies, whether bilateral or multilateral, do not make profits. They give back all the money that they get back in loan repayments. But we can use this money, these are public funds, we can use them to promote institutions and an environment that allows growth to take place, but ensuring that that growth is for poverty reduction. So there's no reason why aid cannot achieve that. That's what the whole issue is about, aid effectiveness. How do we make aid effective to promote development? And development, we mean not just economic growth, but economic and social development, which includes what we've just talked about, gender issues, equality issues, environmental issues, and so on, sustainability, and of course human rights, democratic ownership, and so on. The last question, very important, very difficult. Yes, we deal mainly with governments. But one of the last things that I did mention was the concept of expanding the idea of ownership beyond governments, to include civil society, to include the private sector, to include all the stakeholders, parliamentarians who in democratic societies represent the people. If they don't represent the people, hopefully they'll get voted out next time around. How do we make this inclusivity part of this country ownership? Yes, the ADB deals primarily with governments. But we don't exclusively deal with governments. We are now working through documents like the Accra Agenda for Action and some of our own internal strategies and policies to work more closely with civil society, with non-government groups, on how to implement projects, to use them wherever possible, to use them for accountability, to use them for independent evaluations, to use them for measuring results and outcomes. So yes, this is a big issue. The Pakistan earthquake is a very, very fine example. Yes, there have been a lot of allegations of misappropriation of funds, misuse of funds, and so on. And there have also been stories about how NGOs and civil society organizations have perhaps done a much better job in many ways of distributing the funds that they have received. The answer is not always easy or simple. I'll give you another example, which was the tsunami that took place a year before the earthquake. Two very different methodologies were used to address those two problems. In the Pakistan earthquake case, correct me if I'm wrong, I think the funds were pooled. They were pooled resources, so everyone who gave the funds gave them to an earthquake rehabilitation fund. And in other words, you try to get away with this donor differences and different requirements and stuff. There were pooled resources. It was a sort of a sectoral approach, a sector-wide approach to dealing with that issue. So ADB donated money, the World Bank donated money, individual countries donated money to this one rehabilitation fund. In the case of Indonesia, for example, after the tsunami, it was done differently. Each agency tried to, we developed a plan for addressing the rehabilitation after the tsunami, and then each agency took one chunk of that plan, one part of that plan, and we addressed just that one issue. So it was separate, but part of an overall plan. Now, I'm not sure which one was the better way. Some people feel that the tsunami rehabilitation has been a little more successful than the earthquake rehabilitation. Others feel the other way around. But these are two different ways, and it's experimental. Some things work better in one, some things work better in another. There's no easy answer to your question. The reason why we deal only with governments, let me try and address that one, is because, well, the membership of the bank are the countries that provide our capital. Those are both borrowing and non-borrowing member countries. We have 67 member countries, of which 48 are from the region and 19 are not from the region. When I say region, it includes Japan, it includes Australia and New Zealand. So they are from the region. The others, 19, are from outside the region. Of the regional members, like I said, 3 are non-borrowing. The rest are borrowing member countries, and we only lend to the borrowing member countries. Now, these countries sit on our board, and they're represented by the governments. They're not represented by parliamentarians or civil society or whoever. They're represented by governments. We basically deal, we're a public institution, we deal with the public sector. But of late, we have expanded our private operations through public-private partnerships, etc., and direct lending to the private sector. And we're up to, from 4 years ago, 200 million to last year, 2 billion. So that's a huge jump. 10 times we've increased. 2 billion out of a total of 10 billion. So that's 20% of our exposure is now non-sovereign lending and assistance to the private sector. It's difficult for us to do because sovereign lending is easier to guarantee. The government guarantees it, the country guarantees it. It's a sovereign guarantee. It's not the government, it's the country that guarantees it. We're a AAA rated agency, the only one in the world. The Asian Development Bank is the only AAA credit rating, I think, in the world today. I may be wrong, but I think I'm right. We'd like to keep it that way, especially in this environment these days. We're very cautious when it comes to our assistance, to our lending, and our exposure is very limited to risky investments and risky ventures. But that does not mean that we do not tread where no man has been before, or whatever that Star Trek thing was. We have done things that have put us at risk, but hopefully we have learned from those experiences, and we will perhaps be doing a lot more in the future. We may always be dealing with governments, but governments themselves are beginning to realize that they are not always the best representatives of their country, that they need assistance from their own civil society organizations and from other stakeholders if they need legitimacy. So this accountability issue works both ways, not just for us, but also for the countries themselves.
Okay, one more round of questions I think we can have. 1, 2, 3.
Hi, my name is Ira. I'm an MPP junior. My question is related to your point about harmonization amongst donor countries. Do you think that visibility of the development actor is important at all in trying to achieve objectives of channeling development aid? I'm asking this question because I was involved in a research project to measure how people perceive the EU as a development actor in 8 countries in Asia. And with the exception of Vietnam, what the findings suggested was that the EU was just not visible at all as a development actor. And so is visibility actually part of ADB's strategy in channeling development aid? Thank you.
2 over here.
My name is Martin. I'm an MPP junior student as well. My question would be, I hope it's not too provocative. My point would be there are a lot of there's a lot of research on aid effectiveness. Often it's not very effective. When working on aid effectiveness, morally, I completely agree with all the Millennium Development Goals. They are all very important, and they all should be achieved for as many people as possible. At the same time, wouldn't it be way more efficient to focus on some of those goals instead of trying to tackle all of them at the same time with very scarce resources and then see where that goes? I don't know, it just seems very much like spending very little on a lot of things instead of spending a lot on a few things and actually achieving them. Thank you.
One more up here.
Yeah. You mentioned that multilateral agencies like the World Bank, IMF, ADB are primarily apolitical, and that's a part of their agenda. But in recent years, we've seen them get into very broad themes like good governance. You mentioned your ADB's engagement with the civil society is increasing. In such a context to carry on their policies, how feasible is it for them to be completely apolitical?
Richard Jumali, I'm an MPP junior. I'm from the Philippines. The trend that I see in the Philippines is that the pattern of aid has changed from multilaterals, and there's a gaining percentage coming from individual countries, especially from China. Do you see that as a problematic trend in terms of how much aid comes from multilaterals and how much aid comes from individual countries?
Thanks. And one of my own questions. On the sort of traditional and non-traditional aid givers, I'm wondering how you think about a world where the same countries are both donors and recipients, and countries like China are getting aid from the ADB, but China is a creditor in the Inter-American Development Bank. 2 questions. How does one think of that world? And number 2, how is harmonization going to work in this world with these new players?
Okay. Harmonization and visibility. Well, let me put it this way. I think you ended off by saying how important is it to ADB? I think the simple answer to that is it's not very important to ADB. It really isn't.
Should it be important?
Should it be important? No, it should not be important. For reasons that we've talked about for the last hour and some. Why are we giving this aid? What is it for? Is it for self-aggrandizement? Is it to make ourselves feel good? It's, it's like philanthropists giving money and announcing to the world, hey, I gave $1 million, well, who does that make them feel better? The person giving the money or the person receiving the money? Let's not get into that argument. It's not a good idea. The whole idea behind harmonization, alignment, pooling resources, etc., is so that we do not have to have this kind of visibility. That's just the sort of if you like, the moral argument. But there is a more technical argument for it as well. And I think it links up to a question that was asked next on the MDGs and the research on aid effectiveness. I'll get to that in a minute. And that's basically this, that it's very difficult to attribute or claim what part of which aid is making what effective. Okay? I mean, when we give money for, say, a road project somewhere, how do we know exactly how much poverty it is reducing and in what manner? So attribution is very, very difficult. And since attribution is so difficult, why try and get attribution to begin with? Why try and look for something that is not very easy to define? Why waste all that money and resources? Why waste your time? Unless it is something for purely political reasons. In which case, there's a different agenda. And I don't consider that aid in its traditional sense. Right? I mean, we can talk about money that's given after a particular conflict in a particular country by the country that perhaps caused the conflict in the first place. Okay, that's a political agenda. So let's not go there. You first destroy, then you build. Hallelujah. Great. Wonderful. That's different. But if you're doing it for purely development purposes, then attribution does not make sense. So my simple answer is very categorical. No, it should not be important. It is not important, and that's what we should be aiming for. It's not going to happen very easily because, different countries, like I said, they have strategic interests and so on. And some countries will not. For example, certain countries do not give any assistance to Cuba. Other countries do not give any assistance to Burma. Note that I use the word Burma. I don't call it Myanmar. So you know which side I'm on. There are many other such examples, and so on. That's political. So that's a different issue. But we're talking about aid that is for purely development purposes. And their attribution is very difficult. Your MDG question, I think it's a very valid one. You're absolutely right. Different countries have different track records as far as the MDGs are concerned. It is futile, and it is perhaps even foolish to try and spread the money around so that it tries to address every single MDG in every single country. I don't think that's the intention. That's not the purpose at all. And I may have misrepresented myself if I said otherwise, but the idea behind the country ownership and country priorities and country development agendas is precisely what you are alluding to, which is that you look to see where the weaknesses are, where assistance can be most effective, and where it is needed most. So it has to be demand-based, it has to be needs-based. And so you address those MDGs in those countries where they are the weakest, and not address everything everywhere. Right? That would be the best way to do it. It's not always easy, because a lot of the times the countries themselves don't necessarily have the capacity or the capability to be able to figure out where they need to put their money most. So we have to work together, and this whole capacity development issue is central to that. It's not just capacity of institutions it's also the capacity to plan and manage the development agenda. Not all countries have economic planners or economic policies that are indigenous and that are necessarily best for that country. We can argue about that. You can always say, well, if the country thinks it's best for itself, well, fine. Yeah, that's not the issue. The issue is that as aid agencies, you can determine whether you think your goals and their goals match. And if they match, well, then you provide assistance. If they don't match, well, then don't give assistance. It's as simple as that. Don't give assistance where your goals don't match, because one of you is being hypocritical, and I won't say which one. But that's the issue. But you're absolutely right. It is not very feasible, and it is not a very good idea to spread the assistance so thinly that it has no impact whatsoever. So you have to be very focused, and you have to see where the impact can be. And that's where the whole concept of results come in. So you have to be outcome-oriented, and you have to see what will have the maximum impact. Now, how do you do that? That's an issue, but I think it will depend on the country context, and you have to work in partnership with the country to do that. There was a question on MDBs being apolitical, right? Well, apolitical to the extent that we do not have this kind of strategic interest that we were talking about earlier. Apolitical is a difficult term because no matter how you look at it, and this again is some people think of it as an ideological issue, I don't, which is that economics is essentially politics. I mean, Charles, you can argue with me on this. I don't know if you agree or not. We used to use the term years ago. I mean, if any of you are familiar with economic literature, it was all political economy. There was no study of economics. It was a study of political economy. Economy and politics are almost impossible to separate completely. Somewhere along the way, this ideological divide came about, and that was what we call the neoclassical divide, where they insisted that it was all about individuals and there was no social contract and there was no political issues involved. But it's always been about wealth creation and wealth distribution or redistribution. Otherwise, we won't have a tax system. Why do we have taxes in the first place? The basic reason behind public finance issues and taxes is redistribution of wealth. Don't let anybody else tell you otherwise. If they tell you otherwise, they are lying. That's what it's all about. We take money from the rich so we can help the poor. How do we do it? Building roads, providing water, electricity, police forces, rule of law, etc., etc. However, we give it to people who cannot afford it themselves. That's what it's all about. I'm not a socialist. Maybe I am. I don't know. But that's what it's all about. So nobody's ever apolitical. When I say apolitical, I basically mean we don't get involved in political issues. We don't say we will not help this particular country because it has a particular kind of government. As an example, that's what makes us apolitical. So if you're a member country, unless for some reason you've done some really horrible, nasty thing that we throw you out of our membership, you're still entitled to our funds. So we are apolitical in that sense. What we do does have political implications. Don't get me wrong. It will always have political implications. You talked about CSOs, working with CSOs and so on. Yes, working with CSOs does add a certain political dimension, but I'm not sure if that's just a political dimension or it gives it a sense of more openness and transparency and accountability, which I think is a good thing. Now, if you think that's political, well, so be it. But I think it's a good thing. Because you are bringing in some independent ideas, independent management, evaluation, accountability, and so on and so forth. And I think that can't be bad. That has to be good. Of course, there is that whole issue, and we won't get into that right now because I don't think we have time. There's that whole issue of who are the CSOs accountable to? Nobody's ever asked that question. Are they accountable to anyone? Do they make up their own rules as they go along? Or is that another growth industry? We don't know. I mean, there are some CSOs that are very good, and there are others, I'm sure, that are not. That's human nature, and that's the way of the world. But working with more people than less, having more inclusion than less, can't be bad. So that's a good thing. There was a question on multilateral versus bilateral. Not sure exactly what the question was. Who asked that? Yes. Yeah.
I think that's problematic
Oh,
because
yes, right,
of the
about
interests of
Philippines.
the bilateral donors.
And you mentioned China, and you mentioned something else, and it links up to the question that Charles asked right at the very end, was that is traditional versus non-traditional. Now, it's not so much that the Philippines, and I'm slightly familiar with the Philippines. Apart from the fact that I live there, I've worked in the Philippines for a few years. You know, I mean, we may live there, but because the Asian Development Bank is housed there, that's it. A lot of us don't really know the Philippines because we don't really work in the Philippines, you know. So we know Manila, but we don't know the Philippines, if you know what I mean. But I worked in the Philippines. In the case of the Philippines, it's not so much that they're less dependent on multilateral assistance. They still get a lot of multilateral assistance. But the nature of that multilateral assistance has changed. It's moved from a lot more project and investment, kind of project investment, towards more program investment, program-based support. So there's support for, say, certain kinds of reform programs or governance programs, or the health program, or the education program, or infrastructure programs, and so on. So it's not for a specific project, but it's money that's given to the government for use for their development programs. Okay, so it's program-based approaches, as we call them, or program-based assistance, which is one way of increasing the government or the country ownership of the program. You get the money from the World Bank or the ADB. That's not earmarked for a road from A to B, but it's earmarked for the National Highways program in the Philippines, wherever it may be used. So you have $100 billion that are needed for that. We provide $1 billion of that. Somebody else provides 5. China provides a couple, and so on and so forth. So it's pooled resources. I'm not really sure how much of the assistance that China is providing is in the form of ODA assistance, or it's in the form of investment, foreign direct investment. I think a lot of it is the latter. That's a different issue altogether. FDI, or investments from different countries, are not what we talk about when we talk about official development assistance or ODA or aid. Investment is different. And that's not what we're talking about. China does provide some assistance. A lot of it is technical assistance for capacity development, for research and training and education development, and so on and so forth. HRD, human resource development, etc. But a lot of the other stuff that it's providing is in the form of investments. And those are, you know, Chinese companies investing in the Philippines, and so on and so forth. Whether one is better than the other, like I said, I don't see why they have to be exclusive, why they cannot work towards the same goals and ends. I think that's the issue. And as long as they fit in with a comprehensive, well-developed country program, then we're okay. The last question, countries that are both donors and recipients. China is probably the best example of this. China provides almost $5 billion in assistance to Africa alone. China is a donor member to the Inter-American Development Bank, non-borrowing member to the Inter-American Development Bank. China still borrows $1 billion annually from the Asian Development Bank. Schizophrenic or or what? Well, India borrows $2 billion annually from the Asian Development Bank. India gives $1 billion in assistance only to the Asia-Pacific region alone. China has trillions of dollars in reserves. Not billions, trillions now of dollars in reserves. Why does it need to borrow $1 billion from us? Well, probably because it wants to have a say in what we do in the region. So there's a political rationale behind it. They're a very important member of the Asian Development Bank. They're important not simply because they are such a large player in the region, but also because they are so closely linked with all of our member countries. So China is a very special case. It's overwhelmingly special, let me put it this way. I mean, today, when we look at China, we have no idea where we might be 10 years from today, even with the current financial crisis. I mean, China has an enormous growth potential. Even when it's this year, when it's doing really badly, its growth is 9.8%. And that's a really bad year. It's the first time in 25 years that it has been less than 10%. China, if I can make such a bold statement, I think in 25 years, what China has achieved, the rest of the world has not achieved in its entire history, which is reducing the number of people that have come out of poverty. I mean, reducing the number of the poor. The number of poor that have come out of poverty in China is more than the number of poor that have come out in the entire world in its entire history. It's a phenomenal achievement, but don't get me wrong. There's still a lot more that needs to be done. And China is playing this dual role. It still wants to be a major player in the Asia-Pacific region, and therefore it remains a borrowing member of the Asian Development. Let me give you another example. China contributes to the Asian Development Bank as well, to our soft loan window, but it only contributes $35 million. It gave $350 million in grant assistance to the Inter-American Bank. 10 times as much as it gave to us. Now, I can't speak for China. I don't know why they're doing it in Latin America with the Inter-American Bank. Maybe it's political reasons. Maybe it's other strategic interests. Maybe they think that they can do more good there. I really don't know. But those are just some of the numbers. And it's a very, very easy, difficult question. It is not easy to answer, Charles. The only thing I would like to say, though, is that one of the things that we did discuss in the aid effectiveness debate in Accra on this issue was that generally, I think the overwhelming view was that if a country as a recipient is accepting the principles of Paris on aid effectiveness, then it must accept those same principles as a donor. And I think China, by and large, said yes, they would. So in terms of its aid effectiveness principles, they're on the same page.
Okay, well, look, thank you very much for a very stimulating, very interesting presentation. And I'm sure I would be joined by everybody in wishing you all the best in terms of the work that the ADB, the important work that the ADB is doing within the region on promoting growth and reducing poverty. So thank you very much. Thanks.
Thank you.